rising mortgage rates and soaring rent prices, affordable housing has never been more out of reach. The mismatch between the demand for housing and available supply is driving today's housing affordability crisis. In recent years, the U.S. has underbuilt housing by millions of homes. Fortunately, we have the solution. The American Housing Act would strengthen the low-income housing tax credit program, encouraging greater private investment in affordable rental housing. It would also promote affordable homeownership by mobilizing private investment in entry-level starter homes. And the plan would incentivize local communities to reform restrictive zoning laws that limit housing density and block new construction. It's time for the housing affordability crisis to end, and we need your support to make that happen. Read the full American Housing Act to learn more and help us ensure that every family can find safe, affordable housing.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dennis Shea, and I am the Executive Director of BPC's J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. Since its founding in 2021, the Terwilliger Center has worked to advance the goal of a decent, safe, and affordable home for every American family. We seek to identify the most effective public policies and build the broadest base of political support possible to expand the supply of affordable homes and ensure that those most in need can obtain housing assistance. Today, we're discussing how to preserve and expand the supply of affordable homes through the low-income housing tax credit, our nation's most significant affordable rental production program. Since its inception in 1987, the housing credit has helped finance more than 3.7 million affordable homes for low-income families. The sheer scale of today's housing affordability crisis, rooted in part in a severe shortage of affordable rental homes, has led policymakers to explore ways to strengthen, reform, and expand the housing credit. And that is the subject of today's webinar. We're starting with the conversation with U.S. Representative Susan DelBene from Washington's 1st Congressional District. Congresswoman DelBene has a strong track record of championing bipartisan policies to expand affordable housing production. She is a lead sponsor of the Bipartisan Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which was just reintroduced in the House and Senate last week. We are delighted to have Congressman DelBene join us this morning or this afternoon to discuss this important legislative development. Congresswoman, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is about housing, so let's begin at home. Your district includes part of the Seattle metropolitan area, one of the country's most expensive housing markets. Can you talk about how housing costs and the lack of affordable housing supply impact Washington's 1st Congressional District and the communities you represent?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, I hear about the lack of affordable housing as I travel everywhere throughout my district, but also across the country. Affordable housing is really something that does impact every district. It's urban, it's rural, it's red, it's blue. It's only getting worse. More than 10 million families are spending more than half of their monthly income on rent, and that is just simply unsustainable. And so we know that finding stable housing is critical to having stability in families' lives. It's critical to having a strong workforce and to having strong communities. One example in my district, Tracy, Daniel, and their 5-year-old daughter, Olivia, they are currently living in an apartment in Washington that was built using the housing credit. When they first moved in, Tracy hadn't worked in 13 years. Daniel hadn't worked in 5. And finally, in stable housing for their family, Tracy and Daniel found steady jobs that not only provide them with a consistent salary and benefits, but ones that align with their personal passions and provide them with career growth. That's great for them. That's great for their daughter. That's great for the folks they work for. It's great for a community. So we have much better outcomes that way. But it is critically important that we look at every part of our country and make sure that we have affordable housing available.
I mean, you just underlined the fact that housing is foundational. It's not just shelter, which of course it is, but it's also a platform for upward mobility and better outcomes, better life outcomes. So thank you for making that point. You're the lead sponsor of one of the lead sponsors of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. How would the revised housing credit proposed, and I'm going to use an acronym, in the AHCIA, increase the total number of affordable housing units and better meet the needs of lower income households?
Well, we do have a lot of acronyms. I think pretty much everyone has their acronyms, and we have our fair share in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, as you said, the AHCIA. But also this is about the low-income housing tax credit, which is we also refer to as the housing credit. So the improvements we make in our legislation to the housing credit are estimated to finance nearly 2 million additional affordable rental homes over the next 10 years. The bill would also enable the program to better serve hard-to-reach communities, including rural communities, Native American communities, and extremely low-income households by increasing the housing credit allocation by 50% and lowering the bond financing threshold, which allows states to finance more affordable housing and provide more flexibility so that states can target existing resources to projects in their communities. There's huge demand for the housing credit right now, and really the core part of our legislation is to expand it so it is more available and we can see more projects get off the ground.
Very much, Dan. It's great to see such bipartisan support for the proposal. But despite that strong bipartisan backing, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, I didn't use the acronym, did not become law when it was introduced in past sessions of Congress. Do you see any opportunities to garner additional bipartisan support and momentum this Congress, or to pass the bill as part of a broader negotiation?
So first, I just want to be clear, we have advanced provisions of our legislation in previous bills. So sometimes you can't get the whole bill across and you get pieces through, and legislating can be an incremental process, and that still helps. Clearly, Democrats aren't in the majority of this Congress. As Congressman LaHood and I introduced the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act with 65 original co-sponsors, bipartisan co-sponsors this Congress. Ways and Means Chairman Smith has co-sponsored our legislation in the past and has indicated his support for the program. So we have strong bipartisan support. And now kind of comes the challenges of legislating. First of all, it is it's incredibly challenging alone to get a bill with such strong bipartisan support like we have here. But we also need to figure out kind of how we move it. Sometimes these bills don't move by themselves. They move as part of a broader legislative package, a tax package, for example. And so while our piece may be bipartisan, it could be coupled with pieces that maybe aren't so bipartisan. That can make it challenging to move. So we're trying to figure out the best path to move legislation forward, and do whatever we can to make sure we can find a way to get it across the finish line. But that is always the challenge, kind of how do you move it and what might be packaged with it that might be more controversial than this underlying piece of legislation itself.
Always a challenge. It's a balancing act. As you know, housing credits units built after 1990 start aging out of the 30-year federal affordability requirements. So how can Congress provide greater resources to preserve the number of affordable homes available to low-income renters? And should the affordability requirement or period be extended or set in perpetuity, as the BPC in our own plan has suggested?
Well, that's why the proposals in our legislation are so important. Proposals such as lowering the bond financing test for the housing credit properties from 50% to 25%. That would instantly unlock critical 4% low-income housing tax credit resources at a time when rehabilitation resources are needed the most. I fought to set the minimum 4% rate And when I talked about pieces of legislation getting through in the past, putting that floor in for the 4% rate was something we did a few years ago, which allows more financing to put in properties in order to preserve them. This is helping to finance hundreds of thousands of affordable homes that weren't financially feasible before. But states are now running out of private activity bond financing, and that's also been important to making these deals work. So that's why we're proposing a change in our legislation to use these bonds more efficiently, which will finance more preservation deals.
Well, great. And as you pointed out, there are pieces of the legislation beyond the 50% test, reducing it to 25%. There's also the extremely low income, the basis boost for projects that have at least 20% of the units devoted to serving extremely low income households. So there are various elements of the legislation that could pass separately and would have great value. But I just want to thank you on behalf of the BPC and the Terwilliger Center, Congresswoman. I just want to thank you for your support for this legislation and for the great work you do on behalf of affordable housing in Congress, and want to thank you for that. I want to take this opportunity to invite our virtual audience to come see us in person at the Terwilliger Center's upcoming Summit on Housing Supply Solutions. The summit, which will take place on June 22nd in Washington, D.C., will feature a wide range of experts in government, business, and philanthropy who will share their insights on how to meet the affordable housing needs of America's families. You can find the registration link for the summit in the chat. We will now move on to a panel that will discuss strategies to preserve affordable homes in housing credit properties, which will be moderated by my colleague, BPC Senior Analyst, Francis Torres. Francis, take it away.
Thanks, Dennis, for that introduction and great conversation with Congresswoman DelBene. Hi, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. I'm Francis Torres, Senior Policy Analyst for Housing here at the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy at BPC. We'll be keeping track of the progress on the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act in the House and Senate, as well as providing analysis on any potential changes to the federal LIHTC program. And so to that end, we've recently published a companion article to this event detailing some of the strategies that exist to maintain affordability in LIHTC developments. You can find the link to that article in the chat now. And without any further ado, we'll move on to the panel in which we'll discuss, as Dennis just mentioned, the scale of upcoming LIHTC affordability phaseouts, strategy to preserve tax-financed affordable homes, and also highlight bipartisan proposals such as the AHCIA to strengthen the housing credit. So we're very lucky to have with us today some amazing panelists: Emily Kotick, CEO of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition; Ethan Handelman, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Multifamily Housing at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development; Gerald Hunter, President and Executive Director of the Idaho Housing and Finance Association; and Crystal Cornegay, Executive Director at Mass Housing. Thank you all so much for joining us. So before I get into the questions, if you're watching this live, please do submit any questions for our panel at any time. You can post them in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, and we'll get to them near the end of the conversation. And also, I'd encourage our panelists, the questions might be for individuals, but please feel free to respond to each other's comments. We're very much trying to incentivize a conversation. So to kick off the conversation, I'd really appreciate it if each of you could briefly talk about the work that you and your organization does relating to housing credits and preserving affordable homes. So I'll kick it off with Emily.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you, Francis and the Bipartisan Policy Center, for having me here today and talking about such an important topic. And it's wonderful to follow Congresswoman DelBene, who's been such a champion for affordable housing. We've been working with her as one of the leads on the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act for a few years. And I always like to tell the story about how when Congressman Neal, who was our lead on the bill for several years, became chairman and needed to pass on the baton on the bill, Congresswoman DelBene really competed with all of the other Democratic colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee to get leadership of that bill. And the fighting she did just to lead on this issue is something that we see all the time, as she's helped us get pieces of the AHCA across the finish line, and hopefully some more this year. So And with the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, we are a group of about 250 organizations and businesses that represent all parts of the affordable housing community, including investors, syndicators, developers, state agencies, accountants, attorneys, and we focus on one issue, and it's the low-income housing tax credit. So we are involved in efforts to protect it when that is needed. Currently, we're glad to be more on the offense, and we're talking about expanding and strengthening the program and the ability to not only build new affordable housing, which our nation clearly needs, but to preserve affordable housing, which is such a big part of what the housing credit does. So we're working very closely with the Congresswoman and all of her colleagues on the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. That's our top priority right now. She highlighted a few of the key provisions that would expand resources on the 9% side, but we're also really focusing on the efforts to lower the 50% test that enables you to get your 4% credits down to 25%, which of the 2 million more affordable homes that she mentioned would be possible, that accounts for close to 1.5 million of what would be possible. So huge impact. But there's also a number of other provisions in the legislation that are much smaller. They don't necessarily generate as many resources, but do things like facilitate preservation by allowing you to capitalize the cost of relocating tenants, providing some flexibility around tenant income, things like that, that are just going to make more preservation developments possible. So looking forward to a great discussion today about how we can get some of these things across the finish line.
Thanks so much, Emily, and we're happy to have you join us. Okay, we'll pivot over to Gerald.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. And it's great to be a part of the program and have a chance to talk a little bit about this very critical issue that we're facing around the country. You know, as Idaho's HFA, one of our responsibilities is to allocate the low-income housing tax credit. We do that through the development of a qualified allocation plan. And there's a lot of policy, housing policy, that is incorporated into that. So we're in a position of making decisions about whether the tax credit should be allocated for new construction or preservation. We make decisions about whether it goes towards elderly or family, or whether we're going to include permanent supportive housing in some of the projects that are developed throughout our state. So in the process of doing all of that, we have a very direct impact on how that resource can affect preservation. Some of the other things that we're involved with are the utilization of different financing tools that are out there, grants, state resources, if they're available, construction, permanent financing, bond financing. There's a host of different resources that we can also bring together through our organization to help finance both the preservation and new construction of affordable housing. And then finally, I think one of the real important points that doesn't get mentioned a whole lot is the ongoing compliance of the tax credit units, helping to make sure that those properties are maintained effectively. And I think this is one of the key things in terms of looking down the road for preservation. But there's a big part of that we're involved with.
Great, thank you so much, Gerald. So I'll hand it over to our other state policy expert here, Crystal.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you, BPC, for having me here today. I'm Crystal Cornegay with the Massachusetts Housing Finance Agency, affectionately known as Mass Housing. And we do about unlike Gerald, we are not the low-income housing tax credit allocator, but we do a lot of deals. We do about $750 to $1 billion of lending annually using the low-income housing tax credit, particularly the 4% credit. And so we have a particular interest in seeing that go further. There was a time in our state, at least, which is a very high-cost state in the country, there was a time in which we primarily used 4% credits for preservation deals. But things have gotten such that we're now doing 4% credits with production deals as well. And because our stock here is very old as well, we have a lot of preservation needs. And so we're, like Gerald is describing, thinking about ways in which we can enhance what those credits are. We usually do about $500 million of tax exempt lending annually. And it's April, and by April this year, we were pretty much out of credit. We were out of volume cap, so to speak. And so being able to have that money go further is important. One thing that is happening in our market that may be happening in others is that because we have some very large public housing deals that really rely on volume cap and tax exempt financing that goes with the 4% credit to make that happen. Rehab, new construction, combination. Those big deals are chewing up cap, and we're not able to really apply that across the other needs in the state. And so we look forward to partnering with everyone around getting that resource expanded.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Crystal. And rounding us out, Ethan.
Thanks, Francis. And it's a treat to be here with other housers and to be back with the BPC. I really appreciate all of the work that you all do on housing. And, you folks in the audience may be wondering, well, why did they invite a HUD guy to come talk about a Treasury program? And in part, it's because I see from my perch in multifamily how important the low-income housing tax credit is to all of the HUD production and preservation work that's happening, but to rental housing generally. And I've been working with the program in various ways for more than 20 years. I know what it can do. I know how effective it is. And it really is one of the things we rely on in our work here at HUD when we're talking about preservation or we're talking about production. So when we're looking at applications from owners to build new Section 202 housing for the elderly developments, more often than not, those have tax credits involved. And we know that they're relying on it as part of the capital stack. When we're looking at properties in our portfolio and thinking, how are we going to preserve those? One of the first questions I ask is, have they applied for tax credits? Do they have an allocation? Are they ready? Now, there are other ways to do preservation deals. Folks use FHA mortgage insurance and do refinances, but the equity that a tax credit allocation can provide is pretty powerful. You should know that the administration is committed to housing supply, which includes both production and preservation, right? Preservation is part of adding to the housing supply. Expanding low-income housing tax credit is one of the biggest steps we can take, and you see it in the president's budget alongside other investments that are called for on the mandatory side. So this is worth it for the budget nerds out there or the aspiring budget nerds out there. Generally, housing funding has been on the discretionary side of the budget. This president's budget calls for mandatory side investments for new project-based rental assistance, new funds to help preserve public housing, and investments in the low-income housing tax credit. It's a big deal. And so that's why I'm here and part of the conversation. Glad to be talking with my colleagues about it.
Excellent. We're very glad to have you. So thank you so much for those introductions. I'll just kick it off with Emily. So your organization, the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, just concluded its Affordable Housing Symposium, which also featured comments from Congresswoman DelBene. You talked a little bit about this in your introduction, but I was wondering if you could share for our audience some of the insights from that symposium regarding potential reforms to the housing credit to support preservation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was great to hear from Congresswoman DelBene, especially since it was really exciting to have so many affordable housing advocates and practitioners in town just a week after the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act was reintroduced. And even though this bill has been around since 2016, and I do want to give the Bipartisan Policy Center a lot of credit because the original proposal to increase the credit by 50% came out of the BPC's Housing Commission report from probably close to a decade ago at this point. But everyone said, if this is what the Bipartisan Policy Center is recommending, that sounds like the way to go. And so that's been part of it since the beginning. The new version of the bill is pretty similar to the last version, just because, as we heard earlier with the discussion with Dennis and Congresswoman DelBene, we still have unfinished business from last year. While we have gotten pieces of the AHCIA across the finish line at various points, the last significant one was getting the minimum 4% rate set in 2020. We did get a piece that is going to help a lot using the housing credit with solar and energy credits that got done in the Inflation Reduction Act last year, which is great, but it's not going to increase the number of units we can build and preserve. And those are really the main pieces that we're still working on this year. So it's a pretty similar piece of legislation. What I am really encouraged to see is how much bipartisan momentum there is. So we heard from both the new House Ways and Means Committee Chairman, Jason Smith, on the Republican side of the aisle, and his counterpart and Democratic Chairman in the Senate, Ron Wyden. One thing that's really nice about their working relationship is they really genuinely seem to want to get some things done this year, and they've publicly identified affordable housing as one of the areas where they think that there can be compromise. Now, of course, the bigger question is what bills are going to pass Congress, period, this year. And so where do we attach some of these affordable housing proposals? But just in terms of the basics, hearing the chairman of both committees, despite being on different sides of the aisle, talking about affordable housing being an area of compromise was huge. We also did hear from our new lead on the AHCI in the House, Congressman Darren LaHood, who's new to the leadership team, but is obviously really hitting the ground running. The fact that this bill was introduced with, I think it was actually 66 bipartisan co-sponsors on day one is pretty amazing for a nearly 30 provision bill about the low-income housing tax credit. And even just since it was reintroduced last week, we've added, we're up to 85 House co-sponsors, evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. They just added 10 new Senate sponsors, 5 Rs and 5 Ds. So you're really seeing this balance, this energy, this recognition that affordable housing is a major problem and that this is a really well vetted and bipartisan solution. So that's one of the pieces I took out of that. But of course, over the coming weeks, really the focus is going to be on the debt ceiling, and no one's really anticipating a lot of activity that could serve as a vehicle for affordable housing provisions until probably the fourth quarter of this year. So the other charge that we got really clearly from all of these advocates for affordable housing on the Hill was to get as many co-sponsors as possible on this legislation to make it really hard for them to say no when there is a vehicle. So Congresswoman DelBene told us at our conference, if you clear 218, half of the House, that's a really hard proposal to say no to. And we heard that time and time again from Congressman LaHood, our longtime champion since the beginning, Senator Cantwell. We need to do everything we can so that when a package comes together, when something finally breaks through this gridlock, that we've made it as easy as possible for them to say all of these proposals to expand and strengthen the low-income housing tax credit, to help with the new affordable housing needs and preservation. These are ready to go and can make it across the finish line finally.
Thanks so much. And we appreciate the shout out. And BPC definitely sees this as a priority, right? And agree with you very much that preserving affordable housing should be a bipartisan priority. And it definitely seems like that might be the case with this AHCIA. So we're very excited to see where it goes. And again, thanks for shouting out our work on this subject. And sort of related, I want to move over to Ethan. Ethan, you manage the implementation of federal programs that support affordable multifamily housing, like you mentioned at the top. Could you speak a little bit more about the role that HUD programs such as HOME or the new GRRP, which I know you're very excited about, play in ensuring long-term affordability in new and existing LIHTC properties?
Certainly, and appreciate you giving the shout out to our Green and Resilient Retrofits program, which we just announced last week. It is one of the exciting tools we have for long-term affordability and also resiliency and efficiency. It was just announced. It uses funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave us $837.5 million for retrofits of properties and up to $4 billion of loan authority. So we're making both grants and loans available, designed to be whatever will fit best for what a property needs. So typically a for-profit will prefer a loan, typically a nonprofit will prefer a grant, but applicants can choose whichever they wish. There are 3 different pathways available for applicants. All 3 of those notices of funding opportunity, or NOFOs, are posted now. I encourage folks to go to HUD.gov/GRRP to learn a whole bunch more. But let me connect it up to the housing credit because it's important. Each of those pathways for making housing that is rental housing for low-income households more energy efficient and safer in the face of natural disasters expects that a good number of the applicants will be doing tax credit recapitalizations. So there's a pathway for properties that are in the middle of a recapitalization right now and want to add a few green elements, obviously assuming that there's tax credits or refinancing or both involved. The other two pathways look at comprehensive retrofits, either aiming at a published standard that is net zero or similar in terms of carbon emissions, or one where the owner doesn't necessarily know precisely what they want to do, wants to come to HUD and have us help with the due diligence in planning it out. That also often will have a tax credit element involved because it's part of a larger recapitalization of the property. We have a lot of funds available in those options. I mean, up to $100,000 a unit. So this is real money. But you mentioned other programs too. When you think about long-term affordability, especially for extremely low-income households, that means rental assistance attached to the property. And you know what? That generally comes from HUD, not exclusively, but generally. So our project-based rental assistance contracts are in some ways the gold standard for ensuring long-term affordability. They're renewable, their rents are paid by the federal government, and it allows properties to achieve levels of affordability that are pretty hard to achieve any other way. Similarly, our block grant programs like HOME or CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant Program, are used by states and localities around the country to provide gap financing, to make the capital stack pencil out so that deals can be preserved and new properties can be produced across the country. It is one of the areas where you really see a strong partnership between HUD and this Treasury program administered by the states. We're all working towards the same end. And you also find that many of the entities who are overseeing at the state and local level the ongoing administration of Section 8 contracts are also connected at the state level to the allocation of credits. And it's one of the strengths of the way both of these programs work that there can be cooperation in that sphere.
Great, thank you. Quickly, I want to incentivize our audience. You can ask questions at any time during the presentation through the YouTube chat, and we're very much looking forward to seeing your questions as well. And tying back to Ethan's answer regarding state agencies and state institutions that are a crucial part of the management of the housing credit program, I have a question both for Crystal and Gerald. We can start with Crystal. As a leader in state housing policy, you have experience liaising with LIHTC developers and owners, perhaps hearing from tenants and other stakeholders involved in housing credit development in general. Are there any recurring issues or concerns, besides the ones you might have mentioned in your introduction, that you face or your state faces regarding the preservation or rehabilitation of affordable homes in LIHTC buildings?
Well, right now, the biggest recurring issue and challenge is about the cost of doing business as a result of the pandemic and supply chain issues as a result of rising interest rates. It has just become more expensive to do projects with LIHTC production as well as preservation. What I mentioned earlier around preservation in particular in the public housing field of public housing units in Massachusetts, we have about 45,000 state-aided public housing units in addition to federal public housing units. And so a lot of that becomes a challenge in terms of preservation, but also an opportunity to use those sites to create production as well. And as Ethan described, a lot of those properties are supported by HUD, not just with contracts on the federal side, but also with rent contracts through the project-based rental assistance program that HUD runs. And so the cost of things are concerning, and rising interest rates do not necessarily help with that. And so it's another reason why the fixes that folks are talking about can really help absorb that without necessarily creating new funding sources to deal with rising costs.
Thanks, Crystal. So Gerald, same question. What recurring issues or concerns do you face or your state faces regarding preservation and rehab of LIHTC affordable homes?
Thanks, Francis. Well, first, I would second the comments that Crystal has mentioned about cost increases. But another one that sort of jumps out that has some relationship to that is long-term maintenance of the assets of these properties. One of the things that we find is that, particularly in a growing market, is that the area median incomes on which the rents are predicated oftentimes lag the increasing costs or operating costs of these facilities. And so if you kind of think about that over time, that puts a stress on the cash flows that these properties generate. And the way that ownership sort of deals with that, one of the first and easiest places for them to go is to defer maintenance on these properties. And so this is a challenge that we're looking at now, because as these properties age, as they get to a place where you want to try to facilitate some kind of preservation, you have this deep hole, the deferred maintenance cost, that adds to all the other things you're trying to facilitate, and it increases the challenge that much more. And I guess the other thing I would point out is that this situation also makes it difficult for preservation, in the sense that as you see the market kind of run the way it has, with increasing rent levels on the market side and a slower lag on the affordable side, the incentive for people to convert their properties to market is huge. And the extra cost to try to preserve those properties is huge as well. So it just makes the challenge that much more significant. So that's I think one of the issues, aside from what Crystal mentioned, that's one of the issues we're facing.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Gerald. And you gave me the perfect segue. So a lot of what we are focusing on here at BPC, and one of the reasons for putting together this event today, is the questions around LIHTC year 30, right? So there's a federal minimum affordability requirement for LIHTC developments of around 30 years, which was first set up around 1990. And so post 2020, we're phasing into that timeline for some of the earlier LIHTC developments. And more generally, the concern around market rate conversion is something that we're very much interested in looking at. So I'll direct this question to Emily. The proposed AHCIA bill, which of course has many great things, doesn't specifically address, at least to my knowledge, the question of extended affordability periods. So I was wondering, what role do you think such a proposal should play in a broader landscape of housing credit reforms? And if not through this specific bill, what might be some strategies to advance longer or extended affordability periods, or generally any thoughts on that point?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're correct. The beyond year 30 is not addressed in the current version of the AHCIA. And there has actually been a proposal that has a good amount of support in the affordable housing industry that would extend the affordability period and also provide additional resources for resyndication, recapitalization, to make sure we're not just extending the affordability period, but making sure these are safe and viable properties for the extended life. When we did end last year without having gotten the major provisions of the AHCIA that actually produce and preserve more homes across the finish line, the decision was made to keep the bill pretty close to last year's, just so we could finish that unfinished business. But I do think once we hopefully get some of these major pieces across, so we can actually just address some of the most pressing needs, this would be pretty high on the list of new items that we could incorporate that do already have support, do already have specific proposals behind them. You know, one of the pieces we haven't mentioned, I know this is more on the new construction side, but it does affect the politics around the housing credit, is that we did get the first increase in the housing credit allocation in 2018, a 12.5% allocation increase. And it expired at the end of 2021. I think no one really expected it to, because there were various legislative vehicles that everyone thought would come together, and whether it was Build Back Better or a year-end tax extender bill, this was a pretty clear fit in all of those, but then none of them ended up getting across the finish line. So at this time of skyrocketing rent and inflation, we're actually facing a cut to our nation's primary affordable housing production tool. So that is so urgent. The proposal to lower the 50% test, states are turning down these applications that would help preserve millions of units of affordable housing if Congress can just change that bond financing threshold. We're not talking about standing up a new program. It's just a really easy fix. So until we get some of these things done, the next set of resources we need for this preservation beyond year 30, I think that's a very clear and logical next ask, but we've got some work to do first, and hopefully we can get some of that done this year.
That's great context. Thanks so much, Emily. So on the same question, I want to engage Ethan and bringing the federal perspective. What role do you see the federal government playing, particularly the executive branch, in mitigating the potential loss of affordable LIHTC homes during this period of sort of post-year 30? We've seen some estimates that there might be nearly a quarter of LIHTC affordable units that might age out of the federal minimum affordability period in the next decade or so. And Emily's point is well taken. There are important priorities that are really urgent now, but as we move further and further along into this sort of post-year 30 world for LIHTC or housing credit properties, what proposals that coming from the administration's Housing Supply Action Plan or otherwise might address that particular problem?
So it's a great question, and I will build very much on where Emily started, which is the simple observation that housing works when we pay for it, and it doesn't work when we don't. When we talk about extending affordability, it has to be matched with resources for operations and maintenance and capital improvement. Anyone who's been at a new apartment building and then a 30 or 40-year-old apartment building knows the difference, and they know the difference as soon as they walk in. You can see it. It's about how well a property is maintained, the updates it's had, the way the systems work. It all fits together. So when you think about the Housing Supply Action Plan, which is what the Biden-Harris administration has been focused on to deal with the really pressing housing challenges that are faced, and it's not just about rental housing, but it includes many elements about rental housing. Expansion of the low-income housing tax credit is certainly part of it. And that's why I'm excited to be part of this conversation. We use our FHA mortgage insurance, which over the past 3 years did record volume. Obviously, in the current macroeconomic environment, volume's a little bit down, but it's another tool that we use to expand supply. One interesting wrinkle on it that we restarted at the beginning of the administration is the Federal Financing Bank Risk Sharing Initiative, which sounds complicated but isn't. Our state and local HFA partners can share risk with FHA, and by doing so access very low cost financing through the Federal Financing Bank. That's been a tool that has done more than $1.9 billion worth of financing already, thousands of units, and has real potential as a tool for financing, even as Congress works through the process of potentially allowing securitization of these loans through Ginnie Mae. So we're taking an any and all approach in terms of finding those tools to pay for capital improvements, which is one of the main ways the tax credit program invests, and rental assistance, which I talked about earlier, because you need both capital and operating to make a property work, and we know that's what's needed here. So when you think about the immediate challenges, as Emily framed them, in terms of the financing gaps that are appearing now, also the long-term challenges of what happens to these properties 30, 40 years after they've been created. We've seen that before. Many of the properties that we finance in our portfolio have been around 40, sometimes even 50 years. You see it on the public housing side too, where we are using tools like the housing credit, like our rental assistance demonstration, to preserve public housing, using the same nuts and bolts basics of property finance to make good quality homes for the folks that need them. So it's in some ways it's not complicated, right, we need to pay for it, we need to pay for the operating, we need to pay for the capital. And I think there are a lot of good options for it. The housing credit is going to be central to all of them.
Great. Thanks so much, Ethan. It's great context. So we got a, yes.
This is
Go ahead.
Gerald. You had encouraged us to step in a little bit. I just had a real brief comment that I thought I would make, and that is that the industry, the LIHTC industry, does a wonderful job at developing best practices for the allocation of the tax credit. And that is another, I think that is another opportunity where things like the extended affordability periods can be addressed separate from actions that may be looked at for Congress to deal with. So just, I wanted to highlight that.
Great, thank you. No, and certainly please feel free to answer each other's questions and comment on each other's answers. Thanks, Gerald. And actually, I'll stay with you because we got an audience question that I'll just bring up now instead of at the end of the conversation, because I think it would be helpful for some folks in our audience who maybe are not huge experts on how LIHTC functions. So we have someone asking if someone could briefly, broad strokes, explain the basics of LIHTC. I know, very easy question, and whether or not the units are owned by occupants or if it just applies to owners of large low-income projects is the question. But you could just, since you work directly on LIHTC in your state, I was wondering if you could give us just a very quick, brief overview of how LIHTC works, how you see it.
Well, I'd almost rather hear Emily talk about that, but I'll do my best.
I'm happy to chime in after if you want.
That would be great. So basically the way the LIHTC program works is that the federal government provides tax credits. Investors can purchase properties and receive those tax credits. And so you basically get a developer that builds an apartment building, and then he partners with a syndicator that will syndicate the tax credit to investors that need and can benefit from the low-income housing tax credit. They provide capital. That capital goes in and provides equity investment into the property. With that significant equity, it reduces the amount of debt that's on the property. It makes the operating expenses of the property lower, which then allows the rents on those rental units to be lowered. And all of these properties have restricted rents that are required under the IRS code. And so that creates the affordability for these properties. The tax credit actually goes to these investors over a 10-year period of time. There's an initial compliance or extended requirement period of 15 years. And then there's another extended one of additional 15 years, which gives the 30 years that we've been talking about. And this 30-year period of time is coming up on a lot of the properties that have been built throughout the country. And that gives rise to this concern about those properties, the owners of those properties choosing to convert those units into market rate units as opposed to affordable units. So hopefully that does a real quick job of it. Others can jump in and provide any illumination that they might think is worthwhile.
No, I think you nailed it. The only thing I would just note is, the program was created in 1986. So that's why this 30-year issue is becoming, more urgent as, the first properties financed by the low-income housing tax credit were, completed within, let's say the early 90s. Now is when we're starting, as the program ramped up and more we're getting done over those early years. These are the properties that are now coming up at the end of the 30 years that they were intended to remain affordable. And the question is, what do we do with these scarce housing credit resources? Are we using it to build new housing? Are we using it to keep these properties online and affordable? And when state agencies are receiving applications each year for 2, 3, or more times as many credits as they have to give out, it's a really difficult question how to allocate these scarce resources, which is a common theme with pretty much all housing programs. When there just aren't enough resources, how do we make these really tough and important decisions?
There was one element of the question it's worth probably level setting just for sort of newbies in the audience. This is a rental housing program. So it provides support for generally apartments around the country. There have been a few examples of creative homeownership at the end of the term executions, but the vast majority of these are rental housing. And that's an important part of what I think of like as a housing ladder. If the rent is lower, people are able to save for a down payment and step into homeownership a little later on. That's one of the benefits I think that having lower cost rental housing provides is you're not spending 30, 40, 50% of your income on rent. It's lower, you're able to save, use funds for other parts of your life, including saving for a down payment.
Amazing, thank you. Gerald, I put you on the spot and that was an A+ answer. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for giving that great context. So I'm sure it was very helpful for the folks in our audience. So very quickly, just going back to the flow of the conversation, Crystal, so the specifics of LIHTC compliance are just as determined by state policies as well as federal requirements. I know in Massachusetts, there are some requirements around the percentage of total units that have to meet the needs of households earning less than 30% AMI. There might be others. So I was just wondering if you could share some insights on what actions state policymakers can take to preserve existing affordable units in tax finance properties and generate more supply to meet the need for housing, especially affordable housing for very low income communities.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you, Gerald. I was afraid that somebody was going to ask me and I was going to have to embarrass myself. I will say that the compliance side of LIHTC is very, very important. And one of the things that happens in Massachusetts is we do use our QAP and we do use the competitiveness of the getting LIHTC to actually do affordability. So for at least 20 years now, in order for you to get to be competitive, particularly for 4% credits, you have to promise to keep affordability in perpetuity. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't get to come back and do renovations, do rehabs, but there is a thing in which, you say that you're going to keep this property affordable in perpetuity. There's also, as you described, the idea that at least 10% of the units have to be available to families, households that are 30% area median income or less. But we're also able to do that because Massachusetts has its own rental voucher program as well. And so, as Ethan described, those things have to go together, particularly the lower income, for lower income families. We also, in our QAP, have several principles related to environmentally sound buildings. We give extra points for building kind of systems in terms of the competition. And so we actually use our QAP and again, use the competitiveness of that resource to drive different policy agendas. One of the things we recently did in the state was to require all applicants to include a plan related to the development team as well as contractor team in terms of using that as a way of expanding opportunities to diverse businesses. And so you have to have a plan for how many, worker hours, so to speak, will be for people of color, how many businesses the people of color will benefit from that. So there are a lot of things that as a state allocating agency, you can do with that resource. It's probably easier to do in a community like Massachusetts, where we get 5 requests for every $1 that we have available. And it's very commonly known in our community that that you have to get online, you get in the queue. Ethan's smiling because he was a member of our community for many years. And so we really are strong advocates for making sure that states do as much as they can with the QAP to make sure that affordability lasts as long as possible.
Thanks,
One more thing
Crystal.
I'm sorry, one more thing I
Go
want
ahead,
to add to is like in the 30 years, I will say pretty much maybe in the past 10 to 15 years, the private market, capital markets have begun to see what a sound, stable asset LIHTC properties are, and has really created a real kind of existential threat related to this 30-year thing. In terms of being able to take properties and turn them into the private market. And so this is a really, really important thing to get done. Otherwise, we're in where it's sort of like, you know, plugging a hole. If we can't just do production, we have to actually really focus on preservation as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Crystal, for that context and for the leadership you bring from a state policy perspective. So you mentioned Ethan, and we got an audience question that I'll apologize beforehand. There's a lot of acronyms here, and I will use them, but it seems like a really interesting question. So Ethan, for the GERP, what was the reasoning behind limiting RAD, so RAD, availability to PBRA versus distressed public housing to PBV? And further, only to RAD already closed as of September 2021. So very technical question.
It is, and it's got an easy answer because we were working with the statute. So for those who don't know all of the wonderful acronyms, because I like to translate from housing into English and back whenever I need to. The question is about which types of properties are eligible to apply for the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program grants or loans. And that's really defined in the statute, the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as folks remember, came through the reconciliation process, which put all sorts of constraints on exactly how it could be crafted. So Congress, in its infinite wisdom, said, hey, here are the types of properties that are eligible. All of the eligible ones in the statute are eligible in the program that we put forth. So it is all of our multifamily rent-assisted properties. Public housing was not included. It is one of the parts of HUD's portfolio that desperately needs capital investment. And you see that concern reflected in the president's budget. You saw it reflected in the Build Back Better agenda that Emily talked about earlier, and was certainly one of the pieces that I wish had made it into law, and it didn't. Similarly, those project-based voucher properties were not made eligible under the Inflation Reduction Act, so they're not reflected in GRRP. But I remain hopeful that there will be further action to make major investments in assisted housing in the variety of forms it takes.
Great. Thank you so much, Ethan. So we only have a few minutes left. I'll just finalize with brief comments, brief answers. If any of y'all have any final advice on strategies to address the challenges that LIHTC owners and tenants face around the 30-year affordability period and the near year 30 or going over year 30, or anything just generally you want to comment on preserving affordability in tax finance homes.
So I'll go first real quick, which is to say we haven't talked much about residents, but we should, because that's the reason for doing any of this. And I would encourage property owners, I would encourage state agencies, anyone involved with the tax credit property to engage those residents in thinking through what the future of the property needs, how it's going to get there, and make sure that they are equal partners in this. That's one of the best ways, I think, to get to sustainable outcomes.
I'll go next. I also just want to acknowledge, and Ethan highlighted the administration's commitment to affordable housing supply, but I just want to emphasize how aligned this administration is with the affordable housing community, with the recommendations from the Bipartisan Policy Center to expand affordable housing supply. So it just seems like we have this really clear path for not only the new production, but the preservation. We've talked about how there's a lot of momentum and bipartisan support for the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which is the most serious proposal out there to really get us the resources we need. But we also have a lot of work to do. I mentioned, fourth quarter of this year is probably when we might see any activity. And even though we've got a bunch of co-sponsors on this legislation already, we've got a lot to go to get to 218 and, ideally close to a similar share in the Senate. So please join us in advocating for these proposals. It really takes people in every state and congressional district, and encourage you to help with the outreach on the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act.
I'll step in for a second. Am I there? I'm not sure.
Yes.
Okay, pardon me. Just very quickly, I think this is the kind of issue that requires a real proactive approach. I think if there's a message in this presentation today that people would take away, it's that we're trying to do an awful lot with a limited amount of resources. So understanding what these properties look like, what their characteristics are, where they're located, all of these factors that might help us to target those properties that we can do a good job of preserving is an important thing for us to do. So that would be my my last advice here in the meeting.
And my final advice is that this is very, very important, as we've discussed, and we've discussed why, but we also need to pay attention to the fact that there's a lot of money going to be coming through the system for greenhouse gas reduction through the Inflation Reduction Act, not just the funds that Ethan talked about. And so we need to pay attention to that as well, because those funds will have a focus on affordable housing and distressed communities. And this is a way in which we can leverage the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act with these other resources to really kind of supercharge our outcomes.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. This is all the time we have, and this was a really interesting and fruitful conversation. I just want to thank you again to all the panelists for their comments and for taking the time. And also thank you to the audience members who submitted questions. We didn't get to all of them, but we really appreciate you engaging with our event. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll just conclude by saying that addressing the lack of affordable housing and supporting common sense solutions to ensure the preservation and expansion of affordable homes are key focus areas for the Terwilliger Center here at BPC. As I mentioned at the top, you can find our work, including recent blogs on long-term affordability and LIHTC on our website. So if this event was of interest to you, please go check out our website and our work. And I'll also take the opportunity to reiterate Dennis's invitation to join us at the Terwilliger Center's Summit on Housing Supply Solutions, which will take place on June 22nd at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library here in Washington, D.C. And we hope to see you there. So with that, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope all of you have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.